Hello and welcome back as we get started on the incredible epic story that is Beowulf. Now, I know that there's a wide range of familiarity represented in this class with Beowulf. I know that some of you have taught Beowulf in various settings, grade school, maybe even college, I'm not sure, but I know that there are a number of you who have taught on this before. I know that there are some of you who just simply love the story. I know that there are some of you who have never read it before starting this course. And so I hope that regardless of where you start out on this venture, that it is just that it is a venture, an adventure. I hope that you don't just walk away from this course with some more factual, objective knowledge about Beowulf, even though I certainly intend for you to get some of that along the way. But remember, this course is life, death, and meaning with Beowulf and Boethius. And so I hope that there is an existential element to this, that you're not only equipped to write an essay, although you should be equipped to do that, but that you are led to actually walk alongside Beowulf, that you are led to relate yourself to the kind of valor, the kind of strength that he exhibits. I hope that you come to better understand your own relationship with mortality, as that is a major theme in this story. Across the board, I want for you to become immersed in the story and not just to know more about the story. But now, what is Beowulf? Well, obviously Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon poem. Now, we only have one manuscript of Beowulf, which dates to about 1000 AD, although it's generally believed that the original story is written down by an Anglo-Saxon poet in about 700, and that poet was describing events that were placed in about 400 AD. And so our poet, an Anglo-Saxon Christian, is writing about a story in the Anglo-Saxon pagan past. And so we're going to talk a little bit as we get into the story about how that works, the relationship between the Christianity of our poet and the pagan setting of our story. But anyway, so like I said, this story written about 1000 AD, describing events in about 400 AD, and of course there's some debate about the extent to which this poem is grounded in history, if at all. Now, for what it's worth, I'm fairly convinced that there is some real history present here, and for more of that argument, I recommend that you pick up Tom Shippey's book, Beowulf in the North Before the Vikings, and you can find that in the recommended reading. Now, that one 11th century manuscript that we have barely survived a fire in the 18th century, leaving scars around the edges of the document. And so that we have the story at all is really a mark of great fortune, or perhaps we should even say providence. It does, however, make me wonder how many great epics have been lost to time altogether. Probably a countless number, to be sure. However, I suppose that we should instead focus on the gratitude for what we do have, and there's a lot to be grateful for in this story of Beowulf. Now, this right here is an image of the 11th century manuscript that we have. This manuscript was part of the Cotton Library collection, which was secured by the British Museum in 1706 and was initially placed in Essex House. But in what I suppose would be a twist of irony, within a year or so, it was relocated to a place called Ashburnham House, which would actually catch fire in 1731. It seems to me that if you're worried about fires, the last place you'd want to place one of your precious texts would be a place called Ashburnham House. But regardless, that's where it was stored and where it was nearly lost because of a fire. And you can even see some of the singe marks here. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of the story. There are a few different ways that people have approached the story to discover what its structure is, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in Beowulf. The most well-known scenes are the contest, or really the fights between Beowulf and the monsters, the three main fights he has in the story. You've got Grendel, you've got Grendel's mother, and then toward the end you've got the dragon. But there's just a lot of meandering stuff that happens. And if you've read Beowulf before, you know that. You know that some of the big asides where we go into like a poem within a poem, where we're talking about the Swedes, and we're talking about Sigmund, the Dragon Slayer, and we're talking about all sorts of things that are within the story, retellings of other stories, of history and of myth. And so there's just a lot of stuff that happens in this story. And so there's some question as to how is it actually structured? What is the unifying idea? And so different ways that this has been understood. On one hand, we can say that the main structure revolves around the three fights with preternatural threats. And so Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. One problem with seeing this as the structure of the story is that the majority of the story, something like 70% of the story, is actually about other stuff. It's about speeches, and it's about these other poems, other things that are happening. And so, obviously, the fights are very important, But I think that some question can be raised regarding whether they are the structuring elements or just part of a broader structure. We could also look at this as the destinies of three peoples. And so we've got the Danes of Hrothgar and such, we've got the Geats of Beowulf, and then we have the Swedes, which are kind of on the outskirts of the story. And we see that they are the looming threat that are ultimately going to do in the people of Beowulf once Beowulf is gone. And I think that there's some credence to seeing this. And also, and this doesn't necessarily contradict the other viewpoint, but is kind of a different framework here. Tolkien famously, in his essay, in his presentation, The Monsters and the Critics, so the Beowulf should best be understood as fantasy. And so that gives it this quality of being this timeless art. And so we shouldn't be so concerned about the structure. It should be more of something that we enter into, that we're entering into the realm of myth, of kind of eternal realities. And so to that extent, the exact, especially the historical structure, really shouldn't be taking a priority here. And Tom Shippey, for what it's worth, pushes back on this a little bit. And we'll talk about this more when we look at Tolkien's essay, The Monster and the Critics, which, by the way, I intend for us to do next week in the beginning of the week video. And I'm going to go ahead and upload that essay as a PDF. But I do recommend that you go ahead and pick up this collection of essays from Tolkien called The Monsters and the Critics, named for the titular essay. But there are a number of essays in here that I think are very useful, and some of which also relate to Beowulf. Now, Tolkien's essays tend to be pretty dense, but nonetheless, I think that everyone here can get something of value out of them. But anyways, we'll talk more about that essay next week. But regarding that idea of it being this timeless art, I think that there is something very valuable there. And that speaks to what I was talking about at the beginning of this video, that this shouldn't just be something that we study objectively, even though that has its place, but this should be something that we experience existentially. And looking at it as fantasy, looking at it as timeless art, looking at it as myth, I think is a very helpful way for doing that. Because, as Tolkien says in places like On Fairy Stories, that when you overanalyze a myth, when you overanalyze fantasy or fairy tales, you tend to end up killing that which you desire to know. And so sometimes the best thing that you can do is to not focus so much on the literary criticism angle of, okay, what is happening in the story, and instead simply enter into it and become part of the story. Make it part of the way that you contextualize your own life experience. And I think that there's something very useful about that. In C.S. Lewis's book, Letters to Malcolm, he says, "Any patch of sunlight in a wood will show you something about the sun which you can never get from reading books on astronomy." And I think that's true. He's not saying you don't read astronomy books, but simply experiencing the patch of light, experiencing the sun in all of its beauty and all of its existential glory, well, that's going to give you a different kind of experience, a different kind of knowledge, something more personal, more real, more transforming than you would get simply from reading a book of astronomy. And along very similar lines here, I've uploaded this week Lewis's essay, Meditations in a Toolshed. Now, this doesn't directly relate to Beowulf per se, or I guess I should say it doesn't particularly relate to Beowulf, but it really does relate to just the way we go about the world, the way we go about studies, the way we go about reading books, the way we go about learning anything. And this is an essay that I've started including in just about all of the classes that I teach, both institutional and otherwise, in the public university, in the Christian university, in my independent classes. I think that this is a great essay for helping us to understand what education really is about, how to study in the right way. And we can talk about that a little bit in the Discord or in the Zoom session if you want to, but I definitely recommend that you give that a read. You can find that PDF in this week's supplemental reading. Now, Tom Shippey says, and I tend to agree with this, whichever view one favors, it is clear that Beowulf possesses its unique structure because one poet fuses together history, legend, folklore, and mythology into a complex whole, pregnant with meaning, yet resistant to simplistic attempts to reduce its meaning to a single theme or statement. And he goes on to say that Beowulf is perhaps better read not so much as a poem with a theme, but as a narrative expression of an ethos, of character. And I think that that's right, that this is not a simple moralistic tale, that this is not a simple, even a simple thematic tale where we say that there is one theme that unites everything that happens. I think that instead this is really just a sprawling narrative that is meant to not let us walk away with, here's what Beowulf is saying, but we need to walk away with, here's the kind of character that this poem is exuding, the kind of valiance, the kind of valor, the kind of heroism. Here's what Beowulf is teaching us very broadly about what it means to be human. And so this is something of a romantic tale, something of an existential tale, where the narrative itself is not super clear, it's not super linear. And that's because we're really meant to be called into the labyrinth here, and it's in the labyrinth that we're able to discover something of chief value in a way that SparkNotes isn't going to give you, in a way that a linear narrative simply is not equipped to do. And so I think that there's a lot of value here, again, simply following Beowulf, following the story, and not trying to look at it from the top down. You need to be enmeshed in the center of it. And as you do so, you'll come to encounter something, I think, transformative if you enter into the story the right way. And so let's talk a little bit about this ethos, so about this character that we see in the poem, at least as some beginning frames of reference as you engage with it. And obviously we'll work out this more as we have more of the text behind us. But broadly speaking, Seamus Heaney says this pretty well in his introduction to his translation of Beowulf. He says of the mead halls, and obviously mead halls play a significant role here, because in Anglo-Saxon culture, in the environment that we're looking at, the mead halls really they're not just like the bar that you go to. I mean, it's pretty obvious from the beginning of the story that the mead hall is the seat of power. It's where the Lord governs, as well as where they feast and where they celebrate at the end of the day. This is where the Lord of the Hall, the Ring Lord, will give out rings to those who are loyal to him. And you can think about how Tolkien made use of this idea of the Ring Lord, giving out rings to those who are loyal to him and who did feats of valor for him. And of course, Sauron is the perverted Ring Lord, who doesn't just reward those who are valiant, but he gives in order to dominate, in order to subject people to his will. And so he is a perverted, a corrupted kind of Ring Lord, as opposed to Hrothgar, who is the good Ring Lord, the valiant man who gives out treasures to valiant men, not to subdue them, but to reward them for doing good deeds in his name and for his name. And so Seamus Heaney says of these mead halls, and I'm going to apologize in advance for those of you who know your Anglo-Saxon. I do not, and so I'm not going to overly embarrass myself, and so I'm going to skip over some of the Anglo-Saxon that he puts in here. But he says of the mead halls, within these phantasmal boundaries, each lord's hall is an actual and symbolic refuge. Here is heat and light, rank and ceremony, human solidarity and culture. The novices share mead benches with the veterans and their warrior kings, and hero saviors from the past rub shoulders with young braves, thanes and retainers, keen to win such renown in the future. The prospect of gaining a glorious name in the rush of battle slaughter, the pride of defending one's lord and bearing heroic witness to the integrity and bond between him and his hall companions, a bond sealed in the glio and guide of peacetime feasting and ring-giving. This is what gave drive and sanction to the Germanic warrior culture enshrined in Beowulf. And so this is a place of warmth, a place of festivity. It's a place for warriors of various ranks to come together in solidarity, in companionship, in celebration. This is a place of unity. And the mead hall gains really special symbolic significance when you understand the basic movement of Norse mythology, which is pretty unique in that they don't have a very optimistic view of the future. In the northern mythos, you have this conflict between the gods, who are generally on the side of the good, and the monsters, who are on the side of chaos, on the side of evil. And obviously, the good, those people of valor, those people of valiance and virtue, well, they're going to stand with the gods, but there's this expectation that in the end, following Ragnarok, the gods are going to lose and the monsters are going to win. And so all of the heroism within this mythos is a tragic heroism. You're choosing the good, full well recognizing that in the end, the good is going to lose. But as long as there are fires burning in these mead halls, surrounded by the endless winter, well, you have an obligation to stand strong, to fan those flames of festivity, of warmth, of companionship, of humanity. You fan those flames and you fight against the monsters until your dying breath, recognizing that sooner or later that dying breath will come. But as long as you have breath in your lungs, you fight. You fight for virtue. You fight for everything that makes human society good. That's how you gain valor, but it is always a tragic valor. And so This picture of the roaring mead hall in the midst of the bitter winter is not a bad picture of the northern vision of heroism. As Tolkien describes it in The Monsters and the Critics, he says that as in a little circle of light about their halls, men with courage as their stay went forward to that battle with the hostile world and the offspring of the dark, which ends for all, even kings and champions, in defeat. And I think that beautifully and tragically expresses the northern view of the heroic myth. It's this idea of the long defeat that was always so important for Tolkien. And we'll talk more about that when we get to The Monsters and the Critics, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. Now, here in Tom Shippey's introduction to his translation, he talks a little bit about Beowulf's character as we see in the poem. And Shippey says that instead of just going out and delivering these one-liners and yelling "Hoorah, Beowulf!" like you might see in some of the adaptations, that he tends instead to deliver lengthy speeches, and he actually spends much of the poem talking. His speeches, moreover, are carefully crafted and highly considerate of those around him. Beowulf takes pains, for instance, not to offend Hrothgar when offering his help, and he makes clear to Hygelac that he respects the authority of his king and uncle, even though his own heroic achievements now surpass those of his uncle. Beowulf is courteous. He goes out of his way to thank Unferth for lending him a sword, and he praises the sword even though it proved useless against Grendel's mother. And I think that C.S. Lewis's description of a knight in The Necessity of Chivalry really captures this ideal well that we just saw from Shippey and that we'll see in the poem. Lewis says, "The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also a demure, almost a maiden-like, guest in hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not a compromise or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth and meek to the nth." And that's in The Necessity of Chivalry. And I think that chivalric ideal very much encompasses the character of Beowulf, that he is fierce and he is strong, but he is also humble, and he is loyal to those who are in authority above him. He has a great deal of confidence. And if you look at the etymology of that word, confidence doesn't just mean like you're strong-willed or that you're full of yourself, but confidence, confide, with faith. He fights, his strength comes with faith. And you see that throughout the story, how often he appeals to God to give him victory, despite the fact that he has a great deal of strength. He's regularly relying on God, and he's regularly submitting himself to those who are in authority above him, even if his acts of heroism outrank their own. And so, this is not fundamentally a story about Beowulf the superhero, even though he does a lot of kind of super heroic things. This is a story about everyone. It's presenting a kind of ideal that we all should relate ourselves to one way or another. Not that Beowulf, I think, is presented as being perfect. Maybe ideal is even the right word. Maybe something like archetype. He's an archetype of the faithful, heroic warrior who recognizes his own mortality. He recognizes the bounds of human existence. And so maybe something like archetype or something like heroic profile might be actually better than ideal even. Tolkien says that Beowulf is not, then, the hero of a heroic lay precisely. He has no enmeshed loyalties nor hapless love. He is a man, and that for him and many is sufficient tragedy. And so he encompasses the tragic heroism of the northern spirit. And I think that as people who are doomed to die, right? We are mortals, and so we are all doomed to die. The question is, what do we do with our life? How do we redeem that tragedy and turn it into not fear, but confidence? How do we use the reality of our death? How do we use that memento mori mindset to propel a life of valor that actually makes our life significant and in turn makes our death significant? And I think that those are some things that we can take away or that we can even enter into through our study of Beowulf. Now let's talk a little bit about the pathos, the form, the aesthetics of the story. Tom Shippey says that Beowulf is far from the simple chest-thumping poetry that one might imagine ancient medieval barbarians to have cultivated. Remember that these people are barbarians. This is outside the bounds of the Roman Empire, and so these are people who would be considered outside of civilization, essentially, but obviously that's not really the case. It is instead a sophisticated, heroic elegiac poem, composed by a philosophical author who weaved history, legend, folklore, and mythology into a complex whole that is much greater than the sum of its parts. And so this is a very sophisticated story that's bringing in all kinds of elements, history, legend, folklore, and mythology, into a complex whole. It's a very sophisticated poem. And then Lewis says in his preface to Paradise Lost, which, by the way, I do recommend that you pick up, this book right here is worthwhile, even if you never actually read Milton's Paradise Lost, although you should do that at some point. But this is just a great book that gets into Lewis's literary criticism. It talks about the form of poems, talks about different forms of epic poetry, and so you'll get Beowulf related to the Iliad and the Odyssey and Paradise Lost, and so it's a great book about poetry and especially epic poetry in general. And so be sure to pick up Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost. But anyways, in that book he says that one of Homer's great passages is like a cavalry charge, one of Beowulf's like blows from a hammer, or the repeated thunder of breakers on the beach. The words flow in Homer. In Beowulf, they fall apart into massive lumps. And so Homer's poetry could very easily be described as beautiful. It's very flowy. Whereas Beowulf's, I think, is better described as strong. It's harsh. It's befitting of the environment that it was written in, as well as the environment that it describes. And so there's a strong strength here, like blows from a hammer. And then Lewis goes on to say that compared with the Iliad, Beowulf is already in one sense romantic. Its landscapes have a spiritual quality. The country which Grendel haunts expresses the same things as Grendel himself. The visionary dreariness of Wordsworth is foreshadowed. There's certainly not more suffering behind Beowulf than there is behind the Iliad, but there is a consciousness of good and evil which Homer lacks. And so when he says that the Beowulf is already in one sense romantic, the idea of landscape plays an important role in Beowulf, especially when we're talking about Grendel's lair and where Beowulf is going to encounter Grendel's mother. It's very hellish there in the landscape itself. And the emphasis on landscapes really is typified, or it's best expressed, I suppose, in the Romantic movement. If you look at most of art throughout history, you really don't see a lot of landscape art until you get to the Romantics, because the idea for the past, for the most part, was that the place where you really see agency, where you really see morality play out, where you see that kind of existential import, is in the reality of intelligent beings, especially humans. And so you don't see a lot of just landscape art until you get to the Romantics, where nature itself is said to be expressing something. Well, we see some of that play out in the Beowulf poem, that nature itself expresses some moral quality, moral reality. And so pay attention to landscapes as you read the story. And then I think we're going to conclude this introduction with another quote from Seamus Heaney in his introduction to Beowulf. He says that Beowulf's narrative elements may belong to a previous age, but as a work of art, it lives in its own continuous present, equal to our knowledge of reality in the present time. And so even though we could most certainly say that this is an artifact of the past, I think more importantly, this is an enduring present reality. We're entering into the realm of myth here. And so on one hand, I do think that this story is of historical significance. I think there's good reason to believe that some of the story, at least, is grounded in real history. But what I want us to do is to encounter this not just as a story, but to encounter this as myth, to encounter this as enduring, eternal, present reality. And that's really what it means for something to be eternal, that it is always present. And I think that the Beowulf story, in the most important existential sense, philosophical sense, even perhaps we could say theological sense, I think it is as true today as it was when it was written. Because even though our material circumstances may have changed quite a bit since then, the basic experience of what it means to be a mortal living in an ever-changing world, well, that fundamentally has not changed. And so I hope that we're going to see in this narrative, I hope that we're going to see in this poem, a continuously present reality that is at the very least equal to our knowledge of reality in the present time, if not, at least in some ways, even surpassing our present knowledge. Now, I really look forward to getting into this study with you. I look forward to reading the text. I look forward to talking about the text with you, because this is not a super clear didactic story. I think that there is a lot of room for us all to get something from this story and to take it in different directions. I look forward to talking with you about that in the Discord and especially in our live Zoom chats. And so I definitely hope that if you're able to make those live chats that you do so, because I think that our conversation is going to help all of us to go further up and further into what we find in this incredible story. But that's it for now. Happy reading, and until next time, Godspeed.